French President Emmanuel Macron told President Zelensky that US could betray Ukraine. European leaders warn against a quick deal over the war in Ukraine. Meanwhile, President Macron urges Xi Jinping to press Putin to end this war against Ukraine. What is known about Macron's recent warning over the Ukraine war, and what could this mean? French President Emmanuel Macron privately warned fellow European leaders that US could betray Ukraine in peace negotiations, according to leaked call reported by Politico, citing Germany's Der Spiegel. The comments surfaced after Spiegel published what it described as a portions of a confidential call held earlier in the week. According to the outlet, Macron raised an alarm that Washington might pressure Kyiv into territorial concessions without providing firm security guarantees. Quote, there is a possibility that US will betray Ukraine on the issue of territory without clarity on security guarantees, Macron said on the call. The remarks were part of broader discussions involving European allies and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz echoed those concerns, warning Zelensky US envoys were playing games with both Ukraine and Europe, according to this transcript. Other European leaders, including Finnish President Alexander Stubb and NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, urged European governments to shield Ukraine from potential diplomatic pressure. The call took place as the US continues to push peace framework that has drawn criticism from Ukraine and European allies. Critics argue that parts of the proposal are favorable to Russia, while some individuals familiar with the conversation told Spiegel that leaked quotes reflected what was said. The Elysee pushed back on the most explosive line. Macron did not express himself in that way, a spokesperson told the magazine. German and Ukrainian officials declined to confirm details of the call, citing its confidential nature. The revelation highlighted growing unease in European capitals about the direction of US diplomacy and raised new questions about Western unity as negotiations around Ukraine's future enter a sensitive phase. Meanwhile, French President Emmanuel Macron pressed Chinese President Xi Jinping on Wednesday to use Beijing's influence over Moscow to help end the war in Ukraine, making a direct appeal during a high-profile visit to China and to stabilize Europe's security landscape. Macron, who arrived in Beijing for his fourth-state visit to China as president, frames the war as a global crisis that demands broader international engagement. He urged Xi to support at least a ceasefire and to pressure Russia to halt attacks on critical infrastructure, according to officials familiar with the discussions. French leader argues that China's involvement is decisive to secure any meaningful progress towards peace, emphasizing that Beijing remains one of Moscow's closest economic partners. Macron also called for China and France to move past their differences and work together on global challenges ranging from geopolitical instability to trade imbalances. Xi, who has maintained a calibrated stance on the war, expressed support for ending the war, but offered no public indications that China would shift its position toward Russia. He reiterated that Beijing supports all efforts committed to peace and urged all sides to reach a deal. Settlement. China has stopped short of condemning Russia's invasion, instead promoting itself as a potential mediator while continuing to expand trade with Russia. That dual posture has drawn criticism in Europe, where officials question whether Beijing is willing to exert pressure on Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. Macron's outreach comes as European governments grow anxious about the future of the war and the fragility of Ukraine's infrastructure heading into winter. French president has sought to position Europe as a more assertive player at a time when Washington intensifies its own push for negotiations. The visit also touched on long-standing economic tensions between the European Union and China. Macron raised concerns about market access, industrial competition, and China's growing trade surplus with Europe, issues that have complicated broader cooperation between both sides. For Ukraine, any realignment by China could significantly alter the diplomatic terrain, but analysts caution that Beijing remains unlikely to jeopardize its strategic partnership with Moscow. meaning Macron's efforts may produce more symbolism than results. Still, European officials say even incremental shifts in China's stance could help shape the environment for future talks, as Ukraine and its allies search for ways to secure a durable settlement that protects Ukraine's sovereignty. Macron and Xi are expected to continue discussions on Ukraine trade and global governance during the visit of President Macron. Meanwhile, European leaders privately warned Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky this week to be careful as US intensifies efforts to broker a rapid peace agreement with Russia, a move that has raised alarm in European capitals, according to people familiar with the discussions. During a call on Monday, French President Emmanuel Macron, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen urged Ukraine not to endorse any deal until US provides security guarantees. Their message reflected growing unease that fast-moving US initiative could leave Ukraine exposed if Russia resumes its aggression. According to sources, Macron and Merz told Zelensky that the terms being advanced by US appear vague on what US would do if Russia violates the future agreement. They pressed him to insist on a US commitment outlining military support, deterrence mechanism, and coordination with EU. Friedrich Merz issued a blunt warning. Zelensky should be very careful in the coming days, adding that US officials were playing games with both Kyiv and European partners. The leaders also cautioned that any peace deal signed without robust guarantees could prove short-lived, leaving Ukraine vulnerable and threatening Europe's long-term security. The intervention highlights growing concern in Europe that US push for negotiations, which some European governments view as overly accommodating to Russian demands, risk sidelining Ukraine's closest neighbors. Several European allies who argued that decisions regarding Ukrainian security, frozen Russian assets, and future deterrence frameworks must include Europe at the table, not be negotiated solely by US and Russia. Trump administration has floated a set of principles for ending the war, but US officials have ruled out deploying US troops on the ground as part of any security arrangement. The Monday call came amid a flurry of diplomatic activity as Steve Witkoff met with Ukrainian national security team in Florida, so previous rounds of negotiations with Russia have yielded no agreement. In Kyiv, officials are waiting how to navigate pressure from multiple directions without compromising Ukraine's interest. Following the call, Zelensky echoed the European leaders' concerns in public remarks, warning that any peace deal must be fair and transparent, and that Kyiv would not accept games behind Ukraine's back. European governments, meanwhile, are bracing for geopolitical consequences of settlements that could shape the continent's security. Many fear a rushed or poorly constructed deal could embolden Russia and create fissures within the Western coalition that has supported Ukraine. Despite their differing diplomatic strategies, European leaders agree on one key point: Ukraine should not sign anything until the US puts its commitments in writing, and Europe has a seat at the negotiating table. That's all for today. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, and glory to Ukraine.